This is part 2 of how I built my 530 triple engine out of 2 Yamaha RD350 engines. I'll cover how I made the crankshaft, the extended drive sprocket, and the extended shift shaft. I get asked a lot about how I made the crank for this bike, but it was one of the more straightforward parts to make for this engine. All I had to do was take the 2 central webs that come off the stock crank and add them in so I could press them all together to fit the third rod. I also got very lucky as Yamaha put 12 splines on the crank webs to orient them from each other, so that meant I could do a 120-degree firing order like I originally planned on. The SKF bearings I used seemed to be holding up fine, and they were only about a quarter of the price of original Yamaha bearings. I first began by cleaning the corrosion off of the old crank webs as they were sitting in the other engine for quite a long time. I simply just use a wire brush on a drill press for this, as I can hold the crank webs much easier. I first began by pressing in the big end pin into the primary side crank half. I then hit the 2 halves until they're dead straight before moving on to the next web. I didn't get too much footage of building the crank, as I had never pressed together a multi-cylinder one, so I was busy figuring things out. I then spent about 30 years trying to get the next crank half nice and straight before moving on to the third one. I got it to about 1/1000th of an inch run out, which was, I think, about as good as I could get it. On top of that, I had to worry about getting the side-to-side rod play within spec, so I had to do some interesting setups on the press. I then finish off on the flywheel side and keep hitting it until I'm happy with the result, which is a well within spec run out. I then check that there's no interference when the crankcase halves are bolted together, and there wasn't any, so I was very happy with that. Because the engine was being shifted over to the right about 2 inches, I had to make an offset output sprocket. I begin by skimming down a piece of round steel bar, and then I drill a hole in it so I could fit a boring bar inside. I then bore a large hole through the whole piece and put a slight counterbore on it. I then take the original sprocket and cut the teeth off of it with a grinder so I can turn it down later. I then mount up the core in the output shaft so I can turn it down to an exact diameter. I then take a new sprocket and begin to core it out so I can weld it onto the extension later. This was all very easy as the sprocket is made of very soft steel that is not hard to turn down. I then press together these 3 parts so I can weld them together. I also make sure that it spins straight so that there's no bumpiness while the bike is riding. I weld everything together and then mock it up on the engine so I can begin making the support for it. I make 2 threaded blocks, which I then weld onto the cases. I then cut out a support out of a piece of steel, which I would be welding together. I turned down the pin that would be sitting in the support bearing for the sprocket, and then tack everything together while it's mounted up, and weld the rest on a vise. The sprocket spun very nicely on the support, so after painting it, I decided to start working on the shift shaft extension. All I'd be doing here is extending the shift shaft about 2 inches. So I take an extended piece off a different shaft, put a bevel on each side, tack them together in some V-blocks, and then fill in the rest of the gap with weld. I then file down a little bit of the weld so it can slide through the engine, and after testing it out, everything seemed okay. In the next part, I'll be explaining how I finished the bottom end by extending the sprocket cover, the clutch mechanism, and everything else.